welcome to Apollos Water.
Yeah, glad to be here. That's exciting.
That's not what you said you were going to say. You tell them what you were going to say in the walkthrough.
What has happened to my life? How did I end up here?
I like that better. That's a lot funnier. Okay, I've kept up with you a little bit over the years, and we both went to Trinity. We were there at the same time, didn't even know each other. So, but here's the Fast Five. Are you ready for the Fast Five?
Let's do it.
Okay. The best team in college football, in your opinion, is?
Always Alabama. Roll Tide.
Oh, gosh. See, I was hoping that you were did not become an Alabama fan. It's like a disease.
Or Northwestern, but I can't claim right now that they're the best team in college football. So
they have a football team?
We've been good. Don't knock us, but not lately. Not lately.
Okay. Number 2, you're also from South Dakota. Mm-hmm. And I know you're from kind of a farming background, right? Mm-hmm. So, because I am too. So let me ask you this. What's the best tractor company?
Oh, well, I mean, my dad's kind of going back and forth, but he's a Deere guy now. So he's a John Deere guy. He's riding green.
What was he before?
Whatever he could afford. So, we had some white. I mean, it's kind of confusing. White tractors, but they were gray, so that's kind of confusing. But we had some old Case IH. I mean, we had all sorts of different options. But yeah, whatever he could fix up to make run.
So my dad was a tractor puller.
Oh, I went to tractor pulls too. This is the first podcast when anybody's ever asked me about tractor pulling.
Woo! That's how we roll, Collin. That's how we roll.
So I used to do fundraisers at tractor pulls. Go ahead.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Fundraisers at tractor pulls. What do you?
Well, for the JCs. I mean, you're doing that. Somebody's got to sell all the barbecue sandwiches and everything. So my parents at tractor pulls. My old ag teacher is a professional tractor pull caller.
Is he?
Announcer.
Wow. Yeah. So were you big in FFA?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Star Chapter Farmer, Star Greyhound. We get state FFA degree, all that kind of stuff.
My brother was the president or vice president for the state of Illinois.
That's a big deal.
Yeah,
Illinois is bigger than.
He wears the jacket. You know, he's like, I'm like loser. Anyway,
but your dad was a tractor puller.
He was.
Okay.
He was.
Right.
Yeah. Well, no, He's with Jesus now. Actually, the tractor
Okay.
pulling is basically what killed him. It's odd, but he got.
This got real quick.
It did. Well, he got lung cancer at 35 because he was a diesel mechanic.
Oh, jeez.
And that's what they think caused it. But he also got into the Word of Faith movement, and so he was told not to go to the doctor, and then get rid of his insurance, and he did. And it's a pretty sad story, but he ended up dying at 35. And so, he was young. Okay. He was really young. Needless to say, I didn't go into tractor pulling.
No. Did you? Have you read Philip Yancey's memoir? You should have him on the show. His dad died young, similar circumstance. I mean, just not the tractor pulling, but because he didn't go get treatments.
Really?
Yeah, through religious reasons, and very young.
Really?
Anyway,
I'll have to check that out. Okay. You'll have to give me that info.
Tractor pulling.
Tractor pulling. But he was you got it, you go red or you're dead. That type of thing.
Oh, no kidding. I got you.
He was International Harvester, so I've got all the little tractors.
Oh, I didn't even pick up on it.
Yeah, that's how we roll, baby. I collect those now. I couldn't tell you what they do. I mean, my brother was the green thumb. I'm like 16 years old, and my grandfather looks at me, and I'm like, "Can I drive the tractor?" And he's like, "You're not ready yet."
Which is really insulting on a farm because you're ready when you're 6.
Yeah, my brother was driving. My brother was dealing seed corn at 10.
Yeah,
and I'm 18, and they're like, "You're still not ready." Go read a book.
You should explore other opportunities in life.
That's right. They're like, "You can bale the hay, and that's it. That's all you're allowed to do."
By which we mean toss the bales. You're not getting anywhere near the actual equipment.
Okay, that's just question number. That's number 2. Number 3. Okay, how about this? You've interviewed a lot of people, but the person that you have most wanted to meet and never have, but you want to meet and you haven't yet, is who and why?
Okay, so they need to be alive.
They need to be alive.
Okay, because my answer's always going to be Abraham Lincoln on that one. This isn't going to sound all that kind of sexy here, but I would love to interview George W. Bush.
Oh.
That would be an interesting conversation. I mean, of course, with the Keller book, I've written a lot about 9/11. Those were my first professional years, my college years, all that sort of stuff. Like those were, I mean, that his administration ran from the middle of my undergraduate through my first, through seminary. And so, and I was covering a lot of that different stuff. And so I just never had a chance to interview him. And that would be pretty interesting, I think, if it were a candid interview.
What would you ask him? I mean, what do you want to know?
Well, I think I would just be interested to ask leadership lessons, because how many people do you know who have been at the total height and total low? Like President Obama didn't ever have the heights in terms of the kind of the challenges of 9/11 and the surge of patriotism and things like that, but he didn't also have the lows of the Great Recession, the Iraq War, and everything like that. And so usually I always say to pastors and other leaders that you're not ready until you've failed. So I'd be very interested to know what he reflects on from his failures. And it's also interesting that the two presidents who, in my lifetime, former presidents who are most revered, were Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush, both of whom lost their reelections. So, which is pretty rare. I mean, it happened this last time in 2020, but it's been pretty rare in recent history. So it's interesting to think, I mean, even when everything goes wrong, I mean, Bush is the last president to win the popular vote as a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And been since 2004 since that's happened. So, I mean, he's experienced different stuff, but I like to talk to leaders who have failed and what they've learned from that.
Is that what you're going to call that episode? By the way, welcome to Leaders Who Have Failed. And today,
well, I mean, every leader has failed,
I mean,
but it's the ones who acknowledge it that you can actually learn from.
But I mean, it just sounds like Between Two Ferns, like, like welcome to failure in leadership.
Why were you so bad as president?
Okay.
It wasn't in some ways, but like I said, it would depend on if it was a candid, interview
conversation. Yeah. Okay, well, I understand that. Or number 4. Here's the 4th question. The thing most people don't get about South Dakota is
that we're not North Dakota. I mean, I'm telling you, I've got about a 75% rate of them saying, "Where'd you grow up?" And I say South Dakota, and they say, "Wow, North Dakota. I've never met anybody from there." The whole being in the North but being South Dakota just does not make any sense. So we're not North Dakota. There are 4 senators. Take that. Who's the dumb one now? We've got 4 senators in our 2 states. So, and a total of 1.5 million people.
I'm sure you get I know somebody from South Dakota. I'm sure you get that all the time.
No, I've never met anybody from South Dakota before. And by the way, if they do know somebody from South Dakota, there's about a 50% chance that I do know them. Let me give you a second fun fact, just because this podcast is going so well so far. Let me ask you this. There's a reason I'm asking. Okay. South Dakota's motto is the Mount Rushmore State. Okay. Yeah. Now, most people do not even realize that Mount Rushmore is in South Dakota. That's one problem. Right. Exactly. Okay. But what was South Dakota's motto before the Mount Rushmore State?
Oh.
I don't think you'll get it, but
it's
worth asking.
Badlands? Would it be the Badlands?
That would make some sense, but no.
I have no idea. What is it?
It was the Sunshine State.
Actually, that makes sense because you get more sun than most other people.
Exactly.
Like 300 days a year, right?
It is crazy sunny because like right now, there was just massive blizzards, but it's just bright blue skies and that sun just beaming down and going down to -17. So people get confused. Do you think the Sunshine State? Well, obviously that's Florida. That's why we had to get rid of the Sunshine State. That's Florida. And deservedly so. But my goodness, it's the sun also shines when it's really cold. Sometimes those are the days that you're in trouble. Like, oh no, it's really bright out today. We're in a lot of trouble. So yeah, the sunshine state, people don't realize that.
I didn't know that. But it makes sense to me. I remember trying to figure that out because I wanted to move to a place with a lot of sun. And then I learned that parts of like Washington State got like 300 days a year, and Idaho, and that makes sense. I am a little surprised a little bit though, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway. You won't find many people who remember that, but I was back in a Sam's Club in Sioux Falls about a decade ago and reminded our old flag. It's got the motto on it now. It says Mount Rushmore State, but before it was like the Sunshine State, and that was our official motto. Okay. What else you got?
Here we go. Next question. If you were a genre of literature, what would you be and why?
Oh gosh, realist Russian fiction. So
that's oddly on the tip of your tongue. like you've thought about this.
Yeah. The Russian novelists are not for everyone. But the Russians have a keen ability to be able to tap into the darker sides of reality, and to be able to access deep human emotions. They are not romantics. I mean, Dostoevsky is an anti-romantic, and so I just don't resonate as much with the typical, a lot of the American and British literature of some of the same periods, because it's got a heavily romantic streak. And but the Russians, man, they're true to life. And I mean, I was very much influenced by my undergraduate studies in Russian literature, and just learning about the prosaic life, the everyday existence, that we don't live in the grand sweeps of history. We live in the everyday. And the Russians capture that pretty well at a place of absolute horrific, nonstop violence and pain.
Who's your favorite Russian novelist?
Well, I mean, Dostoevsky is great. Tolstoy, of course, is the master. I prefer War and Peace to Anna Karenina. But one of my more recent favorites is a 20th century writer named Vasily Grossman, who wrote on World War II and has become one of my favorite writers. He's most famous for his book Life and Fate, but also also wrote Stalingrad's first volume of that. But if anybody's listening here and really liked War and Peace, you would love Life and Fate. So just in case anybody out there is wondering.
Anna Karenina is the only book that I've ever thrown across the room. I got so mad. I got so angry at that book. I was like, it's rude across the room. Have you read Have you read that book?
Say what? So which was it? What'd you say?
Gentleman in Moscow.
Oh yeah. Oh, Amor Towles. Absolutely. Yeah. Amazing.
Awesome book.
Yeah, that's a great one. That's easier to jump into than Anna Karenina, but it gives you a sense of the prosaic, because that book is absolutely about this everyday life in this hotel against the backdrop of absolute horror of the rise of the communists. So great book.
Which is so weird, because it looks almost as if it's a type of our culture now, with the cancel culture and what's going on in the trans. You know, anyway, we can get to that all day long. All right. Let's get into it. So we know that you grew up in South Dakota, and I mean, you've given a little bit more of your background in there, but let's talk about the book, jump into it, because our time is limited today. Why did you want to write a book about Tim Keller and his spiritual and intellectual formation?
There it is.
There it is. And look at all this. Check this out. Look at this.
Oh, there it is. That's great.
Boom.
I love it.
I'm writing a lot of notes, man. It's a good book.
By the way, I had that author photo you've got there on the back jacket. One of my good friends said, "I always love that photo. It says, 'I'm your best friend.' No, I'm your worst enemy. No, I'm your son's high school offensive line coach."
All of the above.
All of the above. So I took that. I was very proud of that assessment. I wanted to write that book. I just wanted somebody to write that book. Somebody needed to be able to dive into Tim Keller's thought processes, because no one has ever taken that comprehensive look at what he was doing and why. And he is uniquely gifted at being able to synthesize those influences and access them and deploy them. And just somebody needed to talk with him directly about that before, while we still could. My background has, for 20 years, 25 years, I guess, my undergraduate studies has been history. And I mean, you have to sift through all these things and find out, okay, what did they think they were doing? Why did they do this? You got to piece it all together like a puzzle. I thought, well, somebody needs to write that first draft of history that says, well, here's how he got there. Here's how it progressed, and that's why I wanted to write it.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to be at all objective because it was really good. So there's not going to be any critical like, oh, you could have done this better. No, I was actually caught up. At first, I thought when you started off, I was like, okay, what are we learning about him having his sister take a bike into boxes? I was like, oh, where are we going? Where are we going? But you transitioned really quickly. And I think for me, it meant a lot because I knew a lot of the people that he was talking about, like John Guest. I had known about him. I'd gone to Gordon Conwell. I'd been to Guest Church, actually, right outside of Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And so I knew the area, and just even seeing what was going on at the time, how you captured the ethos, the thought processes, the world in which he came in. I don't think a lot of people think about that. They just know Tim Keller. I mean, anybody that's followed the Gospel Coalition for a period of time would know it. But as you were researching this, what were some of the surprise discoveries that came out that you didn't know beforehand?
Well, I mean, I knew some of the things, but I mean, I felt like half the things in there I didn't have any idea about. And I have worked with Tim since 2010. I've read everything that is published that he's written and listened to a ton of his stuff, but there was just so much that I didn't know. I mean, I think going back to the home, one of the reasons why I wanted to get into the home is because you've got to be able to establish that before you get to his conversion. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure before this book he's ever really talked about his conversion. I had no
idea that his mother was Italian.
Yeah, Italian Catholic, and left the Catholic Church because she thought it wasn't moralistic enough. So, I mean, that's and then went from there to mainline Lutheranism. It's a wild story. And so Tim has not talked a lot about his conversion, not talked a lot about his undergraduate years, apart from a couple anecdotes in there, and not talked hardly at all about his family. And so I wanted for people to be able to see Tim through the perspective of other people as well. And that starts with his sister, because she's the only one who was there, who's still alive, who was with him there in the home. So, and all of that, I hope, becomes a pretty obvious backdrop to why this transforming power of grace meant so much to him, not just objectively, but subjectively. And I mentioned in there that he comes from this Lutheran background. His father's family, the Kellers, are these German Lutherans going all the way back. And I said, well, Luther is not just somebody he studied and not somebody he read and not just somebody whose confessions, but Tim has that kind of Lutheran conscience in some ways. Like, it's a pretty tortured conscience that came largely through the formation of a very fastidious home with his mother as the dominant figure by far. So that was at least what I was trying to establish early on there.
Well, even when you brought it up, I mean, you bring out the mother, you bring out some of her issues and some of the things that she struggled with. You brought out a little bit with the sister, you alluded to it, and then you actually mentioned this in the book, and I heard you get to give your Gospel Coalition video about this, because you said the book's not just about him, it's about Jonathan Edwards, it's about Leslie Newbegin. I mean, you go through a whole litany of different people, and you mentioned, though, the high point was his brother's death. Talk about that for a minute.
I knew enough to be able to ask. I mean, you can just, you look at a family photo and, okay, you've got a younger brother. What happened to your younger brother? I think I knew somewhere that background, but I didn't know the circumstances. I didn't know that he'd been living as a partnered gay adult, that the family was in some ways, just his parents were not really communicating with him about that. And so and it was only through Tim's sister that I was able to talk about how the family learned that he had AIDS. And not only that, but he got AIDS from his partner after he had been teaching safe sex practices to other gay men. So, and then of course I did not have any idea about the circumstances of his brother's conversion in hospice, or his parents coming there to minister to him for all of his final days. I didn't know about any of that. And I think the emotional part of it is that we're close with our siblings in a way that we're just not to anybody else. Doesn't mean we're closer. It's just they have a unique vantage point, pretty unvarnished view of us, and they have a kind of unique experience in relation to our parents as well, and just understanding that. And just to imagine, what would Tim Keller say at his younger brother's funeral? That just felt like an important thing to be able to ask. And as it turned out in the book, I'll leave a little bit of mystery there, but it turned out to be more important than I understood when I asked that question.
I actually felt that was a really interesting insight into him, and probably his compassion, seeing a lot more of his compassion come out in the book against the backdrop, because he was drawn into a world where you had one or the other. You were either in this kind of liberal camp or you're in this fundamentalist camp. And he was always trying to strike a third way, which is probably why he chose Gordon Conwell, because that was very much the same type of shaping of him. I mean, there's so many different figures to talk about, but you had names like Barbara Boyd, whom I had never heard of.
Yeah, I don't think
up until that
have.
moment in time. Give a little insight into who this woman was and how she shaped him.
Well, Tim was certainly influenced by InterVarsity in massive ways. And it's interesting that I got my start at Christianity Today magazine, founded by Billy Graham. And the first project I worked on was a book called The Leadership Secrets of Billy Graham, with the same publisher, Zondervan, that I did this book with. And a major part of that book was Gordon Conwell. A lot of people don't realize Billy Graham started Gordon Conwell. It just doesn't add up for a lot of people. It's just not who they think of as Billy Graham. But what's so interesting with Tim Keller is that his life doesn't intersect as much with American evangelicalism as you would think. He was not somebody who talked about reading Christianity Today all the time, or how Carl Henry was a hero, or how he wanted to become an evangelist because of Billy Graham, or that his parents had converted at a Billy Graham crusade. He didn't have that story at all. His story was, I came to faith through the community and gospel proclamation of InterVarsity, which connected me to the British evangelical movement. And so Barbara Boyd was discipled by C. Stacy Woods, the first North American InterVarsity staff member, Canadian, if I'm remembering correctly there. And he was discipled by Martin Lloyd-Jones. So Keller is clearly just in that stream of the Stotts and the Lloyd-Jones and the and J.I. Packer and C.S. Lewis, just the whole InterVarsity mid-century world. And I think that just helps people to make more sense of Tim. He's been a little bit aloof in some ways of some of the typical American arguments, because he really is in spirit a British evangelical. And so Barbara was the conduit to him of essentially inductive Bible study, and the whole classic InterVarsity methods of close observation of the text. And that was just his foundational view of how to approach the scripture, was formed at a very, very early age from this woman who taught him and many, many, many others to read the Bible through her Bible and Life conferences.
So you see him then get converted at Ivy while he's at Bucknell, and then he goes to... he's at Westminster?
Gordon Conwell.
Gordon Conwell is next. That's right, because he goes to Westminster later, and then to Hopewell. Not just about him. What's amazing to me is the book is not just really about him. It's about Kathy almost as much as it is about him.
Right.
And what I was amazed about her, the fact that she was corresponding with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
I mean, she was like an 11-year-old kid.
Yeah, 11, 12. And then he died when she was 13. She was one of the last people that he wrote.
Which is absolutely incredible to me. I thought that was pretty interesting. But talk about how Kathy has shaped his life. They have really done ministry together, and sometimes she's in his shadow. But as you mentioned in the book, she is, you really don't have Tim without Kathy in so many different ways.
Not at all. So You mentioned John Guest earlier, and one of the things that stood out to me about John Guest was saying Kathy Christie is one of the great is the greatest youth organizer in Western Pennsylvania. Well, I mean, first of all, how often do you have an older church leader identify a teenage girl for what she's doing there?
Mm-hmm.
Second, Western Pennsylvania was caught up in a pretty substantial evangelical awakening during that time. And I situate that within the teaching of John Gerstner, and especially his focus on Jonathan Edwards, as well as, of course, more famously, R.C. Sproul and the Ligonier Valley Study Center in Stallstown, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And so to say that Kathy was the greatest youth organizer in Western Pennsylvania is to say, at this time of revival that was spreading throughout Pittsburgh, which was this absolute Presbyterian powerhouse, she was the most outstanding Young Life student. Young Life was just this huge movement, especially at the time. And so that's Kathy before she ever meets Tim. And it's not a surprise that in Tim's first major, what would become best-selling book, The Reason for God, he dedicates it, if I'm not mistaken, to Kathy the Valiant. And then from there also goes through and says, hey, yeah, my biggest influences are Edwards and Lewis, but I mean, I got to them from Kathy. Kathy's the one who told me as an undergraduate to read the Chronicles of Narnia, because she had been a correspondent with the author of these books. She's the one who talked to me about Reformed theology and about Jonathan Edwards, and she's the one who steered me in these directions. And so, and I think that's true not just in an intellectual sense and ultimately a spiritual sense, but in a personal sense. They are, I don't know that I would say that they're a paradigm for ministry marriages, but they are uncommon in how close they are at every level, whether it's book writing. Kathy worked professionally in Philadelphia as a book editor, whether it's book writing or whether it's sermons or whether it's Q&A sessions or whether it's just, I mean, they've just been partners, emotionally knit together. They spend a lot of time with each other in that apartment on Roosevelt Island. And yeah, like I said, I don't think it's necessarily a model because I don't think ministry marriages are supposed to look the same necessarily. But it's certainly noteworthy from a historical perspective.
Well, then you go from Gordon Conwell, which had so many different professors that you mentioned in there, Richard Lovelace, Edmund Clowney. I mean, these are people that have had huge influence on his life. And I was actually struck by when you mentioned, and it was funny because you call her Betsy Elliott. I mean, of course, most people know her as Elizabeth Elliott. Right. And you said she was really tall. How tall was she? I was trying to look that up.
Yeah, I don't think I actually can recall that. I mean, there's tall, and then there's also posture. And I think it's safe to say Elizabeth Elliott would have carried herself in a pretty strict posture.
Well, even when you mentioned about her talking about how he really developed his position on understanding women and gender, and you cite her walking around the classroom. This is Elizabeth Elliott saying, I'm smarter than most of you in this class. I've gone through more suffering than you in this class. I was reading this like, oh my.
Well, you got to remember the first introduction they get to her is not as Elizabeth Elliott. They get to know her as Elizabeth Leach, the wife of Professor Addison Leach. And Tim is taking, that's why she's at Gordon Conwell. And so Tim and Kathy, well, Tim is taking Addison Leach's class when Addison Leach finds out that his terminal cancer has returned and he's going to die. And then they go to the memorial service. And it's the memorial service that Elizabeth Leach starts, according to my sources, yelling at the students for not seeing their professors as people who need our sympathy and prayer and support, but instead these sort of distant figures. And the response I got was, we had no idea who she was. We just thought she was this demure professor's wife, but nope, it wasn't her. Wow. Sounded like she was quite the you loved her or you hated her. There doesn't sound like there was a lot in between, but the Kellers definitely loved her.
And well, they influenced, I mean, you could tell the influence that she had upon both of them. They were at Gordon Conwell. And then they go from Gordon Conwell to Westminster, where you see this formulation of this urban understanding of ministry with Harvey Kahn and several of the different professors, and even just seeing his love for the city grow. What did you learn by seeing just his understanding of the city? Because, I mean, we can't understand him apart from the city.
I think what stands out to me is that for the first half of his life, he didn't have any experience with the things that we would associate with him. Multicultural ministry, urban ministry, city center, global ministry, no experience with it. I mean, he's a guy from middle class, mid-Atlantic Pennsylvania who goes up to Boston at this, American school, suburban location, and then goes from there to a small town, rural South, or sort of quasi ex-urban, almost South. And then, I mean, that's the first half of his life. There's no city in there. There's no multicultural ministry. There's cross-cultural for a Yankee going down to, a place where the fathers of some of his church members had fought in the Civil War, and that's cross-cultural in that sense for him. But of course, it's the same language, and just no global perspective in there. So I think that was what stood out to me, was that most everything we associate with him just wasn't there.
Well, he goes there, and you see him shaped as a pastor, and you mentioned how over time you see him in like cafes talking to people. He's just listening, he's learning, he's engaging, he's always reading. I mean, he's always reading from the time that he's young. What are, like, you even document a lot of his reading habits. Just as a guess, total guess, how many books does he read a year?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, you'd have to start at 100. I mean, the thing about reading books is that the more you read, as long as you're reading within your genre, the easier it becomes to read. So, and then when you add that, Tim has intellectual gifts that, well, I just speak for myself. Sorry, present company excluded.
Mortals unincluded.
I don't have those. I don't have those gifts. And so, I have an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 1.5-year-old. And I'm just thinking, Tim was reading on his own by 3?
That's crazy.
And you stop and think, oh, well, he must have had parents. No, nothing. They didn't do anything unusual. They had that would have done this. They were a cultured middle class. This is not an upper class family by any stretch. We're talking about middle management, second generation or whatever immigrant. Just this is not a fancy place. They had some opera, but that's your Italian background in there, show tunes, things like that. But reading on his own at 3, man, that's not normal. So I mean, there's just, so I would say it's not so much how many books he's read. It's that he is sitting there now with pancreatic cancer, not knowing how much time he has left, and is still reading.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just what he does. It's not only his hobby, but it's also his kind of distinctive ministry contribution in a lot of ways.
Well, you see that in the book, the development of the reading habits, who he's reading. What struck me though is he read so broadly. You mentioned that he stayed within his lane, but he didn't. He's reading. I mean, he's talking about Charles Taylor. You're getting into Philip Reef. I mean, this
Alistair
is not
McIntyre, Robert Bella. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All these guys.
It's a good point. It's a good correction. It's true.
Well, I'm not trying to correct. I'm just trying to understand.
You're right.
I mean, he's not reading about Japanese art. I mean, he could. Yeah. I'm sure he could.
He had Mako Fujimura as one of his elders, so I'm sure he probably did. Read in Japanese art. Yeah, you're right. I guess what I was trying to say is that if you're listening or watching this and you're 25 years old, that's overwhelming. You're like, I can't read that quickly. I don't know what to do. And I guess my message is simply to say, yeah, you're right. That's not going to happen. It's kind of like what I said earlier about Russian literature. I wouldn't have just run and grabbed one of those books off the shelf. I needed to have somebody teach me what to look for. I needed to be discipled effectively and what to understand there. And so it's just to say that even when Tim was reading those social critics, which is, forms the last chapter of my book, it's because he had James Davison Hunter, the head of the Institute for the Advanced Studies of Culture at the University of Virginia.
He's coming on the show, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's coming on. We've been corresponding about it. His new book that comes out in the spring of 2024.
Oh, I wonder what he's going to feel like when he ends up on the show.
Love it, Collin. He's gonna love it. He's gonna be so excited.
Who booked this?
They're fired. They're so.
I gotta have a talk. What's his book coming out in 2024? By the way,
I can't tell you on the air. I don't want to tell you on the air. I don't want to give it away.
Okay,
I'll tell you after the show's over.
Off the air. Sorry for everybody.
No. It's okay. I just don't want to betray anything that he's shared in case that he doesn't want that to go public. So
okay. Well, I didn't know you were best buds.
Well, that's how I roll, Collin. That's how we roll at Collin. That's how we roll at Apollo Swatter. We're just trying to follow the TJC, catch the wave of TGC right there.
That's funny. That's funny. No, I love it. Well, I mean, he had his help. Mm-hmm. So you can plainly see he was not doing this as a pastor in Hopewell, rural Virginia, with 3 young boys born there in those 9 years. He wasn't reading Charles Taylor back then. He was reading Puritan paperbacks back then. So
or Goodnight Moon. That's what I would be reading.
True.
Goodnight Moon.
That famous author. Yeah. So you're right. That's all I wanted to say was just his reading habits. The one constant would have been Tolkien, is that he would have been reading him for that whole life. And I think what I say in the book is that he's never stopped reading Tolkien.
Well, always reading parts him. You got me with, and I had to read it, the Eucatastrophe.
Yeah, the Eucatastrophe.
What is that? Like, I read it and I was like, what is he talking about? I don't know what this is.
Well, essentially, it's that moment when all hope seems lost and then finds the resolution in there. So it's basically it's the cross. So what he talks about with Tolkien is that sense. It's Mount Doom. It's the gates of Mordor, if I'm remembering correctly, right? So you're at the gates of Mordor, you're on Mount Doom, and it's that moment when all hope seems lost that light begins to dawn. And so that paradigm of literature is plainly built off the biblical pattern. But if you look at it, it's not just a cross. That pattern is everywhere in Scripture. And I mean, of course, it's Pharaoh's army at the river, and it's God's people. Like, where are we? With their backs to the water, we're all going to drown. And then God makes a way, and then Pharaoh's army drowns. And then it's that kind of stuff in there that Tolkien was trying to get at. Of just the great literature has that moment where you think all hope is lost. And what he talks about is the incarnation is itself, these 400 years of silence, no prophetic word, but then the incarnation is that dawn of hope. It's literary terminology, but it's helping to explain the biblical pattern that we see.
Well, you mentioned how it gets really dark and it's right before everything goes great. I thought you were talking about our show. I was like, it's a Eucatastrophe. Catastrophe. was tomato. Going back, I want to talk about his preaching for a moment.
Yeah.
There was one part in the book that I went, have I been doing this? This is the part where you go from a reader to being involved in the story yourself, where you find, I found that I was drawing encouragement and I was drawing challenge. Like, I actually cried, and I know that's I'm going to turn in my man card right now, but I cried because there was a part of me that wanted so badly to. I just see so clearly a lot of the future and how God has shaped him to meet the needs of our current scriptural, current moment for the kingdom of God, and seeing how he has touched so many different leaders and pastors and influencers out there, and how God has used them in such powerful ways. But when he starts talking about preaching, he got into the difference between moralistic preaching and Christ-centered preaching.
Yeah.
He mentioned that, and I found myself going, is that what I've done in my sermons? Can you just for a moment talk and clarify the difference between those two things?
So I'm preaching next week on Daniel 1. And as I was going over that sermon this morning, I was thinking about what a great example Daniel is. I mean, Daniel's a wonderful example throughout there of godliness, of faithfulness, of courage. And I think rightfully so when we look forward to Hebrews, when the book of Hebrews talks about the Old Testament saints, it says that we are to look to them as an example in our faith. At the same time, what it says is that they were looking to a heavenly city. And so we don't become like Daniel because we look at Daniel so much. It's because we look for the heavenly city that Daniel anticipated, but did not fully understand himself on this side of the Christ coming, of that eucatastrophe in there. So what I do in there is I go back, and this is a Keller move to be able to do. I go back and talk about Jesus as the true and better Daniel. And I go back and I look and I say, well, wait a minute. It's so interesting. How many parallels are there? Like Daniel is torn from his home to Babylon, but Jesus voluntarily leaves his home at the right hand of God the Father from before time began. He voluntarily leaves his home, goes into exile to rescue us, as 2 Corinthians 5 says, became sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. So Daniel's a good example of that godliness, but Jesus is the only way to actually deliver us from the bondage of sin and slavery, of slavery to sin and death, and to rescue us, to prepare us then for that heavenly city. He was Daniel's only hope as well. God's deliverance was his only hope there. When you think about the lion's den, all the different things in there, our hope is not in the example. Our hope is in the deliverance, and that's what Keller's talking about. It's what he learned from Clowney. It's what Clowney learned from Voss. On and on and on and on and on. So that's I mean I don't think saying that their example is a bad thing. But there's a step beyond that shows that the example is not sufficient. We need a savior. That's what Keller's helped me to see, and so hopefully others as well.
Let's make sure that I understand where you're saying there. So you're saying that rather than looking at Daniel as the example, looking at as a motivator, look at the motivation Daniel himself had.
I think that's right.
Christ.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So there's no evidence in there that Daniel says, I'm going to survive here because I'm looking to the example of Abraham. It just doesn't say that in there. What it says is that he's entrusting himself to God. He's trusting himself that there will be a salvation. It's almost like the sacrifice with Abraham and Isaac, of like, there will be a deliverance. I don't know how, one way or another. There's going to be a deliverance. That's Daniel's perspective. There's going to be a deliverance. God is the deliverer. And that's, of course, the ultimate example. God delivers Daniel, but it's all a way of foreshadowing the deliverance for all time that God would provide through his son coming. And everything else is this hint at what would be coming eventually. So instead of looking only, I shouldn't say instead of looking only to Daniel as an example, look to the hope of deliverance that Daniel himself looked to. And we have an even greater deliverance that, as Hebrews says, that Daniel didn't even know, which is Christ himself.
That's good. That'll preach. That'll preach, Collin.
All right.
Pass the plate.
I'm confident heading in.
Well, even then, though, looking at that whole part of Daniel and what he went through, and you can take it almost too far, and this is where I get nervous, is when you can say, okay, he's castrated. Well, he doesn't have any descendants, so Christ didn't have any physical descendants. You know what I mean? It's like, where do you draw the line? But I do like the fact of how even Daniel's life foreshadows. I mean, when you see the Magi showing up, in Matthew, and you see what influenced them that they're seeking this star, and you trace it back, and it's really Daniel. It's just incredible how God puts all these things together. And that's what I really enjoyed even about the book. When you look at Keller's life and you see how, I mean, what do you hope that what you have seen and experienced, you know him, you've engaged with him, what do you hope that people take away from this book? And why do you think people should get this book? What would it do to help them?
So all of us have examples. I'm using an example here, all that we've learned from. And what I want people to be able to do is to see how the Lord builds their lives like a mighty oak tree. The core is Christ himself. It's the gospel. It's God's word. But over the course of our lives, whether we're a pastor, a professor, a parent, or whoever else, we grow over time. And what we want to do is grow in a way that's consistent, that's healthy, that's sturdy. We don't want to grow in a way that sort of sprouts up. I mean, I describe it as a lily pad theology, where we just sort of jump to here, then to here, then to here, then to here, kind of tossed up, about by the waves. And I just think Tim's a good example of how to do that. Of simultaneously, I think this is actually a way that many of us would want to be remembered. Go back and have your childhood friends, your sister, say, the Tim Keller of today is that same older brother who always looked out for me, who taught me how to ride a bike when my dad wasn't around and when my mom wasn't interested. He's been a great older brother. He's the same person who was teaching the seminary students after class. He'd redo the lectures to help them to understand. He's still doing that today. Point of he's the same person, but he went from being that small oak tree to being a mighty one. And I think that's a good example for us. That at some level, people should say, oh, you're the same person in good ways, but you've also grown and you never stop growing. That's what I'm hoping people get out of the book.
Well, even when you talk about that, you mentioned how he is walking down the streets of Manhattan reading a book and no one knows who he is.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy that has impacted millions of people around the world. And I'm not exaggerating in saying that.
Yeah.
He's still, though, he never seemed to get a big head.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also because of it's the same point that I'm trying to make. It's about the beginning. People did not treat him like he was special. And so in one sense, he doesn't feel like he's special in a very human way. Sort of like he's still that wallflower at Gordon Conwell doing kitchen duty, reading a book with an apron on over in the corner. That's just who he is. At the same time, he's also somebody who's been saved by grace and grace alone. So I mean, we plainly see from the Apostle Paul, it's so that we don't boast. So if it's all by grace, and in one sense, you're just kind of that nerdy, tall guy who likes to read books that everybody overlooks, that's just kind of that it fits together in getting an accurate or just a realistic human portrait of someone. I hope that's what people see. They see Tim not only as a good example, but also just as a person who's got strengths and weaknesses as well.
You do see the personhood part. You see the humility. I think that's the part that really came through to me. It was not only his intellect, which was towering. I mean, 3 years old, that's the second time I interviewed Van Hooser, and he went to Sunday school and came home and asked his parents these questions, and that led them to go search for answers themselves, and then they came to know Jesus at 3. And then I talked to Craig Keener, and he said at 13, I was reading Plato. And I was like, well, I was playing with Plato at 13. I mean, crying out loud, you guys are making me feel horrible. Like I'm never going to be a good pastor or leader or any of that. You're overwhelmed at the immensity of his intellect, and you feel like you're not going to measure up. You just feel that way. Like, can God not use me? But that's not at all what he would want you to think.
No, and I just said, Tim learned from others. All these different tributaries feeding into one large river. don't turn Tim himself into the river. Find your own tributaries, including Tim, that bring you the water of life, the water where you drink and you never go thirsty again, Jesus himself. So I can write a book called Timothy Keller. I can put his face on the cover of it, but this is a guy who spent his entire life teaching people about Jesus. So I hope that's what people walk away from here, is that this is not about, oh, I don't measure up to Tim, but that everything that Tim has and does is by the grace of God, and that grace of God abounds to me as well.
Which is awesome. But still at the same time overwhelming. That's the part where I went, I'm a really bad person. I mean, not that I'm trying to compare myself. It was more like, have I missed my understanding of what the gospel is for so long, and that moralistic aspect? And I wanted to know more. I wanted to grow, because I do think the culture shifts. And to me, he is that person who was walking along with the culture and showing how to glorify Jesus in the midst of a culture that's shifting all around him.
Yeah.
And that's what I really, really found. I know your time is limited, my brother. I know you've got many of these to do. I want to thank you for coming on the show. You know, one of the things that we try to do is we say to people oftentimes on this show, here's your water bottle for the week. Something for you to sip on is you're watering your faith. What is one concluding thought that people can take with them this week as they listen to the show, their water bottle for the week that they can sip on?
I think I'd probably just go back to what I said, right? You know, that last point, the waters of life, or the water of, well, I mean, I just think about the river of life at the end of time, the way water always is this consistent message of its judgment, but then at the same time, it's the means of deliverance, but then it's also the means of sustenance and provision. And that's such an interesting parallel to grace of what grace rescues us from, which is the wrath of God, the penalty due for our sin. But then also at the same time sustains us, but is also that which guarantees that one day we'll be sort of in that new Jerusalem to come. And so I love what you're doing with the Apollos water idea, and it's got a lot of wonderful biblical imagery to draw on there.
Well, I obviously I didn't create that part. I mean, God did that himself.
Yeah.
And he's called it into being to be able to help water people. I mean, like what you guys are doing. I mean, you guys are planting and watering, and we try to take a lot of the things that we see with Keller, and he's been such an influence on us and the people that he mentions.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis has had a huge influence on us and what we're trying to do, as well as Lessing Newbegin and James Davison Hunter. As we try to work through a lot of these things. And I learned a lot more just from a resource perspective on who to look at, what to read, what he was reading. I'm really curious, and maybe this is for a different time, but how did he develop such a wide variety? Like, who did he choose to read? That's what I want to know.
I think it's eclectic. I don't think there was a plan. I think it was just kind of the way
on it. Like,
I mean, just
look up Robert Bella.
Yeah, well, again, that all it came from Hunter, though. So at different times, I mean, Tim was not just a self-starter. He had that curriculum at Gordon Conwell that introduced him to all this stuff, that set him on that trajectory. And then he had somebody like James Davison Hunter to help him with that. So, yeah, I mean, I think he's a wonderful teacher, but he's also a student and always has been. And that's a good posture for all of us.
That is a good posture for all of us. Brother, I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a delight. Wish we could do it longer. We'll have to do it again.
That'd be great.
I'd love
That'd be great.
But thank you for coming on Apollos Watered.
Thanks. I loved it. Thank you.